Imperial Yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through hybridization. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes that complement modern hops. And as a Kveik hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without any negative issues. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Brewing yeast has evolved over hundreds of years to become really good at its job, making beer. One of its primary responsibilities is turning wort sugars into alcohol and CO2 through fermentation, or in verb form, attenuating wort sugars. Say what? Attenuating? What does that mean? Well, I'm your host, Cade Job, and a few weeks ago I talked with John Palmer, and he talked about two phases of fermentation, attenuation and maturation. John and I spent an entire episode talking about maturation, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Laura Burns, Director of Research and Development at Omega Yeast, about attenuation. That process of reducing wort sugars to alcohol and CO2 is kind of a big deal in brewing, and unless you're trying to make a non-alcoholic beer, getting the yeast to make alcohol is kind of the point. Yeast will happily ferment given the right conditions, and so we need to talk about those conditions. We need to talk about attenuation. What is attenuation? How do we measure it? There are nuances like what is apparent attenuation? What is real attenuation? Thankfully, Laura and the folks at Omega Yeast recently published a top crop article on attenuation that answers these questions and introduces the idea of the yeast dinner plate. It's pretty cool stuff, which I hope you'll enjoy. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you get awesome rewards like access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. So last month's guest was Dana Garvis of Oregon Brew Labs, and if you missed your chance to ask questions about beer and brewing science, it's okay. You can still watch the session on our private Patreon Facebook page when you become a patron. So please head over to patreon.com/Brewlosophy to find all the information you need to get access to this awesome resource. And I want to say another big thank you to everyone who's left a rating or review of the show. If you haven't yet left a rating or review, please do so. Every review helps us improve the show. I read them all and I love hearing from you. So if you haven't yet done so, please take some time to leave a rating or review. Feedback is brought to you by Haas, who in collaboration with the hop breeding company developed an incredible new hop variety known as Talus. As the progeny of Sabro and open pollination, Talus is known to impart beer with a complex blend of intense fruitiness with hints of coconut, oak, and pine, while contributing minimal grassy, oniony, or other undesirable characteristics. When we ran Talus through the Hop Chronicles, a majority of blind tasters rated their preference as a 7 out of 10 or higher and indicated hoppy pale ale and IPA as the style it'd work best in. If you haven't yet tried Talus in your brewing, you don't know what you're missing. Learn more about this novel variety as well as the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. All right, listener Danny wrote in. He said, "Hey, Cade, been listening to your show since the beginning and always intended to send you a message, so this is 140 weeks late. Gotta say, your deep dive into brewing came along at the perfect point in my brewing education. I'm one of the many brewers that started out in lockdown. I loved New England IPAs, and I figured I would give it a go. I'm a go big or go home kind of guy. It started with a lot of internet reading, YouTube, and of course podcasts. I fixated on Brewlosophy because it struck a chord with me. The experimentation was the foundation that built a better understanding of everything beer-related, styles, process, biology, and ingredients. Being hungry for information, I reached a point where I wanted more in-depth understanding, but found online technical articles and papers just too big of a step. I needed an intermediate media, and fortunately, the Brew Lab started. It captured very in-depth subjects, but with a layman's twist that was great to identify subjects to focus on. For instance, your yeast starter episode with Maria Mutsoglu, episode 62, was inspirational. It led me to researching yeast respiration, fermentation, the Crabtree effect, and so much more. It's influenced my yeast starters over the last 18 months to using a 1008 wort with a decent amount of zinc, enriched nutrients, air bubbled through the starter via a 2-micron filter to prevent infections to ensure enough O2 is available for a very healthy yeast. Anyway, brewing-wise, I still love light APAs and hazy, but in 2021, I joined the UK Norwich Amateur Brewers Club. Shout out to NAB, who educated me in beers I had never heard of. In fact, yesterday, I brewed a lambic. I'm intending to rebrew every year and blend to make a goose. Before I wrap up, I just want to say I never miss a show and think that Applying the Science is a great addition. Both the Brew Lab, Brewlosophy, and Martin's YouTube channel are great, and to show my appreciation, I finally committed to giving a little bit back through Patreon. Felt right to support you guys, so hadn't considered the extra content. But what a great bonus that's turned out to be. Anyway, keep up the great content. Cheers, Danny. Danny, thank you so much for that awesome feedback. It's great to hear that you're getting what you wanted out of this, that the Brew Lab is providing that intermediate media between technical articles and still adding a layman's twist to it. I really appreciate it. That's what we're going for. And of course, yeah, look at all the other amazing stuff Brewlosophy is doing. Martin's YouTube channel, the Brewlosophy podcast, the online website, and of course, becoming a patron is awesome too. So thanks, Danny, for writing in, and thanks for listening. All right, I'm going to take a quick break, and I'll be back in a few minutes with Dr. Laura Burns talking about attenuation. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. To make beer, yeast takes sugars present in wort and turns them into alcohol and CO2. It's the basic fermentation equation: sugars in, alcohol and CO2 out. I've done several shows about the other things that happen during fermentation, like protein synthesis, cell growth, DNA evolution, but we haven't done a show about the big one yet. And my guest today, Dr. Laura Burns of Omega Yeast, is here to talk to us about attenuation. Laura, welcome back to the Brew Lab.
Thanks, Cade. Great to be here again.
Yeah, this is a really cool topic. And of course, this is based off of a Top Crop article that you guys published a few months back. But yeast is really cool, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and it's honestly, I was brewer at one point, and just kind of thinking through this stuff now through the lens of, a yeast geneticist, it's just fun. And I think we'll get into some cool applications of why we do certain things in the brew house and how yeast perform, and kind of link it all back to some of the details in the genetics. So I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, I guess I'm preaching to the converted here, right? I mean, obviously, you as the director of research and development at Omega Yeast, right, a major yeast supplier, I hope you like yeast and think it's really cool. Otherwise, your job is going to be really difficult.
Yep.
But also, since last time we talked, you have entered into, well, maybe actually, during the last time you talked, but in any event, you're now co-chairing the technical committee for the World Brewing Congress, which is coming up here this year. So why don't you give a quick plug to the WBC?
Sure. So it's really an annual meeting to combine kind of our international brewing academics and our MBA and ASBC groups, and bring content from all angles, and kind of it's going to be anything from more ASBC related lab QC research, and also getting deep into like brewing raw materials, or even just the process of brewing. But it's all really like current research in brewing, and then experts who can put together kind of more workshop based topics to dive into the details when we don't really get a chance to all the time at the brewery. So it's going to be a big educational opportunity for anybody who wants to learn a little bit more, like they do here at the Brew Lab. And certainly, if you haven't been before, don't find it intimidating. It is the World Brewing Congress, but, and the master brewers, that you are all welcome. And it's certainly something that everybody at every level can take something away from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's topics on sensory, there's topics on yeast, microbiology. I mean, there are going to be, detailed in the weeds topics like what we talk about here on the Brew Lab, but there's also stuff that's just like, optimizing your mash tun, right? Or like optimizing that part of the brewing process. And so there are topics that everyone can talk about. And it is really the World Brewing Congress. So it is, like you said, there's international research that's going to come here. And it will be my first WBC that I've ever attended, but I am excited. And remind us of the date, Laura. That's in August, I believe.
Yeah, I think August 12th to 14th, I'm pretty sure. There is a website, World Brewing Congress. If you Google that for 2024, that'll give you all the details. Abstracts are open right now for submitting technical talks and workshop ideas. So we're soliciting, everybody to come on and kind of present some of their ideas and topics they'd like to share at WBC. But that all is accessible on the website. And it's in Minneapolis. So it's a nice central location for most people in the States to be able to make it.
Yeah, and a great spot for beer, right? Minneapolis, Minnesota is a great spot for beer. Yeah, and it is August 17th through the 20th. So if you're interested in attending or you've got a talk that you want to submit, go ahead and do that. But on today's episode, we're talking about attenuation, and that is probably a topic that will be mentioned more than once at the World Brewing Congress, right? This whole concept that yeast take the sugars and ferment them to make alcohol and CO2. But I want to just kind of start there at the top. What is attenuation, Laura?
Well, attenuation is really describing how much of the sugars that are present in the malt are consumed over a fermentation. And, when we say sugars, it's really carbohydrates, because it can be anything from a simple sugar like glucose down to a higher order kind of oligomer of simple sugars called a dextrin. When we're in barley, much of this during malting starts to break down and provide some of those simple sugars. And then we kind of finish the job in the mash to promote more conversion of the starch that's stored in the barley seed into sugars that are accessible by the yeast. And then, attenuation is really the measurement of how much we've been able to convert to sugar and provide the yeast, but also how much the yeast is able to consume. And that all links back to the yeast genetics too. So some yeast can consume almost all sugars that you provide them, including the complex dextrins, where others can really only maybe take in the smaller hexose sugars.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? That yeast genetics can play a role here, and that's something we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But you mentioned a whole bunch of things there that I think are really interesting to sort of dive in and break down a little bit more in detail, right? You mentioned that there's starch in malt, right? And that gets converted into what we as brewers talk about as fermentable sugars, right? Sugars that the yeast can ferment that turns into alcohol and CO2. But that starch is just a chain of individual fermentable sugars, right? Well, a chain and kind of like knotted up like a yarn ball, right? Is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah. And, we make use of all the enzymes in that malt package to really break down the dextrin. But there's different branch points, and composition of that dextrin can vary from amylopectin to amylose. And how we use the enzymes in the mash and how we use through malting allows us to determine what types of sugars are there in the end for the yeast to consume. And yes, attenuation, what we refer to as a brewer, is really just the amount of sugars consumed by the yeast, or like your gravity change, really.
Yeah, exactly. So your gravity change. So that's the point where it comes in for brewers, right? It's the change in gravity from starting gravity to finishing gravity. And really what we're interested in, that's a measurement, right? Starting to finishing gravity. But what it tells us is how much sugar the yeast consumed. And that's important because we know then how much alcohol was produced. We know how much CO2 was produced. And we know if our yeast was happy and healthy, which is also something that we'll get into here in a little bit. But that is sort of the start, right? The first thing you have to know is when is that measurement of the amount of sugars that are available for the yeast to consume, right? To consume and make into alcohol and CO2. And you mentioned earlier that yeast genetics can play a role in this too, but there's also been this sort of evolutionary pressure that brewers have imposed on yeast. So as I understand it, yeast is actually really good at fermenting sugars, especially brewer's yeast.
That's right. Yeah. So, we in yeast terms, we call this domestication. So just like we domesticate dog breeds to, have certain traits, that they're hypoallergenic or, they're super cute. We kind of have
or they don't shed. Yeah.
Exactly. So we pushed our yeast into these traits that we really enjoy in our beer. So part of the domestication process has allowed our yeast to ferment maltose, which not all yeast do. Some yeast in the wild will ferment maltose, but the brewing yeasts have really exploited their genetics to do it well. And that includes, duplicating these genes that are required for maltose utilization and kind of even coming up with kind of new ways of making sure that they're finishing the job. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. But yeah, we've kind of built these yeast into expert attenuators just through the process of domestication and using them in industrial brewing.
Yeah. Using them in industrial brewing and domesticating. One of the easiest examples that I think of too is, for me, I always remember that first batch of beer that I made when somebody told me I had to wait several weeks for my beer to be ready, right? For fermentation to be ready. And I was like, well, but I want to drink my beer now. I want it to be like baking a loaf of bread or something, right? I make it, get the yeast ready in the morning, and then I bake my bread in the afternoon and I have it to eat. But no, unfortunately, it takes some time. And one of the most obvious to me things of evolutionary pressure is the speed at which yeast can consume those sugars, right? And have a fermentation complete in 2 or 3 days. That's a way that we have domesticated yeast. And you mentioned things like duplicating the genome, right? What is it? The Crabtree effect, where it switches over into fermentation so it can rapidly regenerate some of these I don't know exactly what to call them, the precursors for energy production, I guess, or cofactors. There we go. Cofactors for energy production. You would probably know better than me those kinds of topics, right?
Yeah, so that is one of the really unique things about Saccharomyces cerevisiae or our budding yeast, is that they have this phenomenon called Crabtree effect, which makes them expert fermenters. They, instead of going through respiration and growth and kind of just building new cells, they just plug away and ferment in the presence of high amounts of sugar. And that allows us to harness them and use them in many industrial settings for production of ethanol or even just preserving food, or making CO2 in bread. But all of this relies on the fact that they already innately provide, the great fermentation capabilities with Crabtree effect.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think there's other ways too that brewers have imposed their evolutionary pressure on yeast, like top cropping, right? Cold fermentation, all of those things.
Yes, and we drive other traits like flocculation for bottom cropping, or buoyancy for top cropping, or some of the other things we don't really quite understand the selective pressure for, but we've created a lot of brewing strains that are non-phenolic. And for humans, this is a great thing, because a lot of people see that as an off flavor. But it actually, it was an event through domestication that provided these strains that were non-phenolic to us. So there's a lot of different ways we've domesticated our yeast, our brewing strains.
Yeah, right. And a lot of it is about changing the conditions for survival, right? And that kind of brings us back to the attenuation example here, before we get too far off on the weeds about yeast evolution and such. But it's about the conditions for survival. So yeast, that Crabtree Crabtree effect thing, which we've talked about on prior episodes. But that Crabtree effect essentially allows yeast to be really good at fermenting, and they need sugars in order to do that, right? Anything higher than 2 grams per liter, and they're going to start fermenting. That's what the Crabtree effect says. So the yeast then ferments those sugars and makes alcohol and CO2, and that's what we like in beer as brewers. Now, attenuation, like you said, Laura, is a measure of how much the sugars are consumed by yeast. So let's talk then some math. We'll talk some math first, then we'll talk some science. How do you calculate attenuation?
A lot of it, which kind of the basic calculations would be for apparent attenuation, or kind of just the change in Plato that you perceive. So if you were starting at 10 Plato and fermented down to 2 Plato, that would be an 80% attenuation or apparent attenuation. Now, it's a little bit tricky when we want to measure the exact consumption of sugar, because when we ferment, we produce ethanol. And when you produce ethanol, that changes your gravity measurements, because ethanol is less dense than water. So you have artificially kind of like skewed your gravity measurement to be higher than it should be. So with real degrees of fermentation, your ethanol that's not being measured by your hydrometer, or well, it is being measured by, but not accounted for in your apparent attenuation calculation, is actually skewing your results. So in a real degree of fermentation, you may be reaching so you may be reaching 0% sugar, but an apparent attenuation would actually be a negative measurement at that point. You'd be measuring in the -1, 2, or 3 Plato. So yeah, it's a little bit confusing. If ethanol is, I think I might have even said it reverse, but yeah, if ethanol is lowering the density, then you're artificially measuring a less dense solution, which makes you think that you're fermenting further than you are.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So your apparent attenuation might be actually larger than your real degree of fermentation, because that alcohol is reducing the apparent amount of sugars. But this is just like the physics of it, right? The way that we measure gravity, right, is by a hydrometer. That's like the easiest example, right? You put a hydrometer into some liquid, and it gives you a specific gravity reading. That specific gravity is essentially the density of the liquid in relation to water, right? And so that's what it gives you. It gives you that density reading. Alcohol lowers that density. So if you have a starting gravity, like you said, Laura, of 10 Plato, and then you stick your hydrometer in some wort and it reads 2 Plato, it might actually mean, because the alcohol is lowering it down, that you're up at maybe 3 degrees Plato, right? So yeah, so that's kind of the way to think about this apparent versus real attenuation, and that's a really key important thing for brewers to look at. And you gave a fantastic example in the Top Crop article, so I'm going to read that here. It says, a good example of this would be when real extract, so real extract is the amount of sugars that was left, right? When real extract, not accounting for the alcohol, is 0, which means that absolutely 100% of the sugar is consumed. In this situation, the apparent extract would be a negative value, and is why seltzer and wine fermentations finish below 0. The density of ethanol is less than water and results in hydrometer measurements below 0. Beer will typically only reach less than 0 if there's diastatic yeast present, or if the brewer has added exogenous enzymes to break down the remaining dextrins. I think that's a great way of describing this whole issue. So again, the math for attenuation is just the percent difference of starting gravity versus finishing gravity. So if you're using Plato, like Laura said, 10 to 2 means you have an 80% attenuation. Same thing, you can do this.
Apparent attenuation, yeah.
Correct, yeah, thank you. Apparent attenuation, that's key, right? And you can do the same thing with specific gravity, right? If you start with a wort that's 1040 and you go down to 1010, what is that? That's a 75% attenuation, something like that.
Yeah.
You can just do you can do the simple math, and that'll give you the apparent attenuation. But the important thing to know for yeast is that real degree of fermentation, that real attenuation, which accounts for the ethanol in solution. So I wanted to ask an example. So on the OYL 004 West Coast Ale 1 package, it says 73 to 80% attenuation. So first, what does that mean? And second, how do you, as a yeast yeast supplier actually calculate that number to be able to tell us that there's this range of 73 to 80%? And maybe a third question is, why is there a range?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as a supplier, if we've given an indication of the apparent attenuation or apparent attenuation range of a strain, we're kind of comparing that to the historic use of that strain and what kind of styles that's been previously used in. So if, with an American ale strain, if it's producing kind of pale ale products and attenuation rates, then we would use that as a kind of a guide to describe the attenuation of the strain. And that would kind of be just like you would in a BJCP style guideline, the attenuation ranges of those given styles. So that's kind of one of the blueprints we use. And then another factor that we consider is so if you were mashing and you were trying to make the most fermentable wort or the least fermentable wort, and there's a percent of maltotriose that you're, changing in that fermentability profile, how well is this strain going to get through that maltotriose? Is it one of the higher attenuating strains? Would we put it in a higher range of attenuation, which means that it would be better at consuming maltotriose? Or is it one of the lower attenuating strains and that we would kind of bin into a lower attenuation range? So a lot of it comes down to historic use, and then some of the guidelines we provide are really just a range because what we were just talking about, if you make a seltzer with these yeasts, their attenuation range is not 73 to 80%. It all depends on how you set up your fermentable wort profile. And so that kind of makes it difficult to specifically give a recommendation, but our recommendations are based on historic use, style guidelines, and kind of the best and worst case in varying mashing. If you were trying to mash in an alpha amylase range, you'd have a lower attenuation, whereas if you're trying to mash in a beta amylase range, you would have a higher attenuation. So kind of that range that you would typically see in beer.
Yeah, that makes sense. So can OYL 004 ever achieve 100% attenuation?
Absolutely. Yes, it can. So one of the things that, sometimes we might actually ferment with a wild yeast strain or a lab strain, and we want it to mimic kind of more of a fermentation you'd see in a brewery, but they don't utilize maltose. So in that case, you can add in some brewing enzyme, some amyloglucosidase or amylo 300, and allow that strain to make its way through all of the wort because you're providing it with an enzyme to break it down and give it in its simple form, its glucose or fructose form. So yes, using those exogenous enzymes can help you shift all of the sugars to the simple form and give yeast the candy that they are looking for and not make them do too much work in utilizing all that maltose. Or you can also give them a dextrin base or dextrose base, like a sugar wash that you would give for a seltzer. And in each of those cases, you'll get down to zero real extract or 100% attenuation with about any strain you use. The next factor that'll play in is their ethanol tolerance.
That's a good point. Yeah, because depending on how much dextrose or you give them, they might actually poison themselves with the ethanol that they're producing as part of fermentation. But so that's a key point there then, right? You can achieve a 100% attenuation depending on the amount of the sugars that you give to the yeast. So does that mean then that difference, say 100% attenuation if we gave them pure dextrose versus 73 to 80% attenuation in wort, that difference is the sugars that are available to the wort?
Exactly. In a brewer's wort, we're assuming we're kind of making a standard mash regime, and we're kind of providing a range of fermentable profiles, but the range is kind of limited to what we'd state in that attenuation range. So yeah, we're not saying that if you were giving it straight sugar, it would be limited. It's really just in the context of wort, what we'd expect in attenuation. Yeah.
And so that's what that means then, right? The 73 to 80% attenuation that's listed on your website and on your packages and stuff. That means this is the expected attenuation in like a typical wort, and used in the style or whatever that we're suggesting it be used, like West Coast ale being used in some sort of pale ale or something like that. Not trying to ferment a lager with it, right? Which might not change the attenuation. That'd actually be sort of interesting. One question too is that is that attenuation 73 or 80%? Is that real or apparent attenuation?
It's apparent attenuation.
Apparent attenuation, because that's what most brewers are actually going to measure, right? They're going to measure that.
Exactly.
You're not going to distill the wort off and then, measure the alcohol and then remeasure the retentate and all that stuff. There are methods out there that you can do that, and I've done that, and it's time consuming and difficult. Most people are just going to use a hydrometer or the handheld densitometer, which is going to measure apparent attenuation, not real attenuation. Okay, we just talked about the sugars, right? We talked about if you gave yeast, if you gave OYL 004, 100% dextrose, it would reach 100% attenuation. So let's talk the other side of the coin. And here's where I want to go, but I'll ask some other questions first. I want to get to sugars that the brewer's yeasts cannot assimilate. And to get there, you mentioned dextrins, and we've tossed that around a couple of different times. What are dextrins?
So dextrins are the carbohydrates that we target in the mash to break down. They're the higher order starch molecules. It's a starch package. That's what a seed is it's providing all of this starch to germinate a new plant. Like with malting and mashing, we're harnessing nature's ability to break that starch down like it would during germination, but specifically using it to just make sugar wash for yeast to ferment. So the dextrin is always going to kind of remain in that wort because there's limits to the amount of conversion you'll get, and also with the enzyme ranges that you have in the mash, it makes it pretty hard to specifically digest. And so basically it's just kind of interesting. In the mash, you start in the lower temperature range with the beta amylase enzyme, and that's the enzyme that actually breaks the starch down into more simple sugars. It breaks down the starch from the ends. And then you go into the next temperature rest, which is alpha amylase, and that actually breaks it apart through the middle. So beta amylase is kind of limited on the free ends, but the alpha amylase is breaking it down throughout the whole molecule, throughout the middle. So it's kind of the reverse order if you want to get the most sugar out of your grain. But that's what we have as brewers. That's what we have to work with. So, providing that those enzymes are getting really great extraction by using the alpha amylase to really get a lot of the dextrin into the wort and provide some of the simple sugars, but then, fully converting it over through the beta amylase and getting more fermentable sugars.
Yeah, and so when you say for simple sugars or fermentable sugars, we're talking about like fructose, glucose, right? Those are the single units, like the smallest of a unit. And then table sugar is fructose and sucrose bound together. Then maltose is 2 glucose molecules, right? Maltotriose is 3 glucose molecules. And then you have maltotetrose and pentose and all those. But essentially adding 3 glucose molecules, 4 glucose molecules, 5 glucose molecules up to amylose and amylopectin, which can be hundreds or thousands of glucose molecules kind of like chained together and branched and all that, right?
Exactly. Well, and then within those, what I was just talking about, like the enzymes that are actually breaking and cutting apart the starch molecule determines how much of that becomes a simple sugar, a hexose, or a maltose, which is a disaccharide, or a trisaccharide, getting into the maltotriose. And so, based on, the mash temps, the pHs, and kind of where you are in conversion in the mash, you can either get a really high efficiency, mash, which means you extracted the highest amount of extract out of the malt, but then also how much of that extract will be fermentable is the next kind of question. Like, what is the composition of the extract?
Yeah, what's the composition? How much is glucose? How much is fructose? How much is maltose? How much is maltotriose? And how much are for glucose and higher? And I kind of cut that off right there as 4 and higher, because there's this interesting phenomenon about like maltose and maltotriose. So brewer's yeast consumes maltotriose, but not all brewer's yeast brewer's yeast consumes maltose. There we go. But not all brewer's yeast consumes maltotriose. And that's kind of a domestication issue that you were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, and inherently kind of yeast has these maltose genes, like the male loci. There's 5 of them that have been kind of characterized in brewing strains, but they're just basically duplicated in different regions of the genome at the ends of the chromosomes. Just kind of they carry multiple versions of the maltose genes. But there's all the other kind of research into transporters that can accommodate not only maltose but maltotriose. And that's where strains differ. Some of the strains will only accommodate a smaller maltose molecule when they're taking it in from the wort. So they have these little permease channels that allow them to uptake those sugars. Some of them are a little bit wider and accommodate maltotriose, and that's what allows certain strains to ferment higher attenuations.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's like the size of the molecule plays a role, right? The yeast can't actually consume it. It's like trying to eat a quadruple hamburger and fit that all in your mouth, right? You just can't do it as a human. You can eat like a single hamburger, right? A single patty, and you can get that into a bite, and maybe a double if you're feeling good. But like getting into 3 or 4, suddenly you're too big and you can't even consume it. It's like the same analogy there for yeast.
And, we have a lot of other ways of influencing attenuation and things that we do in brewing. So, when we're talking about the mash and setting up the right fermentability profile, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but, maltotriose exists outside the cell. Unless a cell can uptake that maltotriose, it's a lower attenuating strain. But since an example like hop creep, there are actual enzymes that break that maltotriose down, and then the strains can uptake those simple sugars, the maltose and the glucose. And so we influence the process of attenuation through other methods that we use just in making beer, which is kind of, just another layering. And so we'll get into that a little bit more later, but, our specific attenuation ranges we've kind of stated for our strains can be influenced by a lot of the things we do in brewing.
Mm-hmm. And, this is also an interesting point too, about like wine yeast. Wine yeast typically doesn't ferment maltose. So it's not used to it because there's no maltose in wine grapes. But I wanted to ask a question then, before we get to a break, so if you have a maltose yeast, can you turn it into a maltotriose positive yeast that it also will suddenly have that, or do you have to go through? Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll ask that.
Yeah, you just can't. So, we could take a very simple approach and just engineer in the permease with the CRISPR, that is possible, because we know what genes are promoting maltotriose uptake. But you could also do what we did as brewers and just further put selective pressure on the yeast to be able to ferment maltotriose. And that's something we call, basically adaptive lab evolution, but building in kind of a selective pressure to get them to evolve it on their own. And that's, so if we wanted to get a yeast to ferment maltotriose, we could grow them in a really maltotriose rich media and kind of maybe sprinkle in a little bit of glucose so that they really thrive, but force them to finish the job with maltotriose, and that would start to evolve. And actually, researchers have done this and shown that it's very successful. So it's something that, it is possible.
Wow, that's pretty cool to, like a traditional way of creating new things is rely on the evolutionary rely on the evolutionary pressure that you're giving it. You're putting it in a maltotriose heavy environment and saying survive, right? Or don't, right? And some yeast won't, but then some will evolve and survive. And then those that survive all the way to the end, you now have a yeast that consumes maltotriose.
Like me, just understanding how yeast actually can do that. Like what type of genetic changes do they evolve to build these new traits is pretty interesting, because they can, they just basically open up that channel a little bit. They just evolve, like, a lot of it involves gene fusion events, but they can adapt and promote a channel that then can uptake maltodextrin when it didn't before, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think of like if you did that to humans, like throw them in the water and be like, okay, survive. And some I don't know. Would it be like Waterworld with Kevin Costner? And I don't know. Anyway, that's getting a little too far and too sci-fi out there. But the long and the short of it is that yeast is an amazing organism, and not just because it makes beer, but also because it makes beer and does a lot of other really cool stuff. So let's take a break, and then we'll start talking about factors that influence attenuation.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the West and the East Coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Purchase new wiper blades from O'Reilly Auto Parts today and we'll install them for free. See better and drive safer with O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Setting up the conditions for a successful fermentation is one of the most important jobs of a brewer. Yeast is happy to turn wort sugars into alcohol and CO2 so long as it's in the right environment. Laura, how do we know if yeast aren't in the right environment? Or how do we know if we did a good job of setting up the right conditions for them?
Yeah, and that actually is a really good question. So some of the methods from, ASBC would give you kind of like, how do you do a forced wort, fermentation and kind of look at the hot side and make sure that you've prepared your wort in the correct way. But there are some brewery lab methods to do this. But we really know often if you're like, oh, I was expecting to finish out at 70% attenuation, but I'm at 50% attenuation. Everything I knew going into this said I was going to do a great job, but now I tried this new malt type, or maybe I had a bunch of roasted malt in there and I'm not used to using it, So sometimes there definitely are very obvious signs, and you're showing like unexpected results. They didn't ferment. Well, we might have done something wrong giving them the right sugar profile.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think that's one of the easiest ways, in my opinion, is like, okay, I read the yeast package, even if it's the first time I've used this yeast, right? I read the yeast package and I go, okay, it's supposed to get 73 to 80% attenuation. I got 50%. Wow, that's way off. Okay, something that I did or gave to the yeast was very different. Or there was some issue that I'm not thinking about. But and especially if you're using that yeast regularly, or if you're like have used a yeast multiple times and like I'm constantly at 75% attenuation, or 73 to 76% every time I ferment, this is what it is. And like you said, I change an ingredient, or I didn't realize that we didn't oxygenate the wort at the beginning of this. I forgot to do that, and now I'm way off. I'm at 60% or 65%. It's definitely an easy way to look at and say, okay, there's something wrong. I need to try to fix this. Or there's an opportunity to improve, which can also be something too, right? If you're fermenting with the yeast for the first time and it says 70 to 80% fermentation and you get 50%, that means that there's maybe an opportunity for you to help that yeast out more, change your wort or change those things. But that's kind of what I want to talk about in this episode, is what are some things that we can do to improve attenuation, or to hit the attenuation that we want, because it doesn't necessarily need to improve. Sometimes we need to reduce the attenuation, right? Sometimes we need to make a wort less fermentable to hit a target. But to do that, the analogy that you used in this Top Crop article about setting up the yeast dinner plate, I think gives us a fantastic way to think about how you can change, the sugars and things that are available to yeast. So tell me about the yeast dinner plate.
I mean, this I do have children, so it almost makes me think of an analogy as like these some of these strains are a little picky. They might not want to eat all their vegetables or but yeah, it can, like if you think about it, those starch molecules are kind of similar to like the fiber on the plate. Not every strain is able to get through that and ferment that fully. So we just kind of like bend our main groups of sugars that strains can or cannot use and put them in the dinner plate and kind of indicate the percentages of what you'd expect to see in wort. So, if you have glucose or your simple sugars being about 20% of the wort, think the rest of the wort is mainly maltose, so maybe 50 to 60% with some maltotriose, maybe up to 10, 15%. And then the rest of the dinner plate would be your dextrin, and that could be anywhere from 10 to 20%. So the varying percentages of these sugar groups is kind of like your food on the plate. So with a typical wine strain, when they're so picky, they're only going to eat the simple sugars, those hexose molecules or sucrose. Those are the kind of ones who really won't really like touch the rest of that wort. So they're not going to get any more nutrients or any more sugar out of the wort that you provide them. And then Brindis shales may not have as great of maltotriose utilization, so they're just going to pick out the maltose and the glucose. But you get to something like an American ale or a lager strain, which has really great maltotriose utilization, and now all that's left is the dextrin, and that's really the leftover unfermentable apparent extract that we were talking about before. Yep, and then you get cases like diastatic yeast where now they get everything off the plate. They're the best eaters of the group. You don't have to worry about it. They clean up their plate. So
yeah, it's like thinking. I love that analogy of thinking about it, right? The kids that eat their vegetables and don't, right? Like you said, wine strains, if you pitch them into wort, you're going to get maybe like a 20% attenuation because they're not going to consume maltose and maltotriose and dextrins. So, if you've got a typical brewer's wort and glucose is 20% of it, that means that's all they're going to eat. So you're going to have a very, very minimal fermentation. But this is an exciting opportunity for non-alcoholic beers, right? This is something I know that you guys have looked at, and that's pretty interesting for thinking about ways to make non-alcoholic beers, right, Laura?
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess in that case, you can think about limited fermentation. So this is like possibly using a maltose negative strain, like those wine yeast or wild yeast strains. Or you could think of limited fermentability. So limited fermentation relies on the yeast's ability to consume the sugar. Limited fermentability would be the brewer's job of making a dextrin base, basically something that only provides a teeny bit of sugar for that yeast to ferment. Even if it was a maltotriose positive strain, it only can consume the little bit that the brewer gives it. So that is really what we dig into when we think about troubleshooting attenuation, is how hot side factors can influence attenuation, and then how cold side factors influence attenuation. Our bread and butter is the yeast, but we also have to think about what the yeast eats. So the hot side is really where that all comes in.
Yeah. The hot side depends on where, what veggies and what, proteins and stuff you're setting on the plate, right? It determines that. And if you have a picky eater, like for example, a Belgian ale, that won't consume a lot of maltotriose, if you're trying to improve that attenuation, you want more maltose and more glucose and less of the maltotriose and dextrins. So it's a really cool way to think about like setting up the dinner plate for your yeast. The main takeaway here is for this portion is that the composition of your wort matters, right? It's not like I'm just going to put some malt in and you run a mash and then drain off the sugars. No, the temperatures is going to play a role, and what you're setting up on the dinner plate matters. And again, another great quote from the Top Crop article, it says the percentage of attenuation a yeast strain is capable of depends on how well they take up sugars. And most strains of brewing yeast consume sugars in a specific, predictable way, beginning with the smallest, simplest sugars, glucose, fructose, and maltose, and then moving to the larger, more complex ones like maltotriose, and then dextrins. With this knowledge, you can design your recipes to maximize your fermentables according to what strain of yeast you plan to use. So it's this whole idea of fermentability. So let's let's start by talking about hot side. So if you want to affect your attenuation, what are some hot side things that you can do?
Yeah. So, this one was a tricky one when I started brewing, just to kind of get a grasp on enzyme rages and how that affects the apparent attenuation of the finished beer. But actually, it's an interesting discussion, but one of the most fermentable worts that you will produce is around 148 degrees Fahrenheit as a mash rest. And that's because you're well within the beta amylase range, but you're still getting activity from alpha amylase. So it's encouraging the sugar profile to be broken down to the most maltose, the least maltodextrose, and also get a good, efficient extract out of the mash as well. So as soon as you're thinking about your mash, that's kind of one of those factors. So, what temperature range are you targeting for what fermentable profile?
And on that temperature, that's an important one, right? Because those enzymes are setting up the dinner plate. It's like they're cooking they're taking the amylopectin, which is the starch molecule, and breaking it down. And it is, like you said, it's backwards. You mentioned this earlier, right? Where beta amylase is just snipping off the ends, right? It's snipping off two glucose, so it's snipping off a maltose at the end of all of these chains of sugars, but then alpha amylase is the one that's coming in the middle and like chopping it off, right? And so it's like it's I've heard the analogy of like a tree branch, right? So if you think of like amylopectin as a tree, beta amylase is just chopping off the ends of the branches, and you can eat a branch by doing that, right? You can chop, and like a little wood chipper, right? That's like you put the branch in and then it splits off, but you still need somebody to break out the branches, and that's where amylase is coming in. It's chopping off those branches so that you can then put it in the wood chipper of beta amylase. But the temperature is kind of like the opposite of what we would need if we were designing this ideally, right? If we were designing it, we'd want the branches all chopped off first and then feed everything into the wood chipper. But the wood chipper has a lower temperature than the amylase. And so that's a struggle, right? But it is important.
Yeah, and actually it allows us to, be a little bit more, if you wanted to target a less fermentable wort like we would in a hazy IPA recipe, then you just mash high in that point, because you're wanting to avoid the wood chipper or the beta amylase and maximize kind of like the sugar profile that would provide kind of residual dextrin or maltodextrose. Brewers have quite a bit of flexibility just on mash temperature and targeting, different ranges of attenuation. Mash pH is another one, because these enzymes not only have their optimal temperature, but they also have their optimal pHs. That is a little bit harder to target attenuation with, but if you're off on your mash pH, you're certainly not getting the best use of your enzymes. Staying within like a 5-2 range is pretty good as a target. And then in the water to grist ratio, this is actually kind of one of those concepts I've heard explained multiple ways. The one that makes the most sense to me is if you have a concentrated mash where there's a ton of sugar and starch around, at some point, you'll have plenty of access to the starch, but there's going to be so much sugar developing through the conversion that you start to inhibit the activity of your enzymes. Your equilibrium shifts and your rate of, enzyme breakdown and decreases. So the grist ratio can influence how well your enzymes are acting on that dextrin base. And the wort composition. I mean, like, what's the enzyme package going in? Like, how well is your malt modified? Are you using raw malt, unmalted grain? Are you using a lot of adjuncts? Because like the enzyme package is going to be really important in there too.
Yeah. Like what are you starting with? And this is where we talked about with Dr. Harmony Bettenhausen several episodes back about the malt COA, right? What's your diastatic power going to be on there? What enzymes are you coming to the table with? What's your, grain crush, right? Because that's going to determine the amount of availability of that starch. But that water to grist ratio is an interesting one too. This is what has made sense for me in my head. It's like, it's more sticky, and right. It's like if you think about syrup, right? If you put syrup and you touch it with your fingers start to stick together. So if you think about enzymes that are having to move around to hit these different starch molecules to then do their job. Moving around in liquid water would be easier than moving around in a sticky syrup. So that's kind of how I think about it. I don't know that the enzymes are actually sticking or attaching to anything. So to be fair, like, I don't know if that's actually what's going on, but that's sort of how I think about it and how it was described to me. So yeah, changing your water to grist ratio. But wort composition also affects things like pH, right? If you're using a bunch of roasted grains, your pH is going to go down, potentially below a level where the enzymes are optimized. So all of these things on the hot side can affect the sugars that appear on that yeast dinner plate, right? And this is a recipe design consideration as much as it is a process consideration. If you're trying to make an English ale, you don't want a super fermentable wort, right? So adding something like dextrose to it may not be very useful if you're trying to make just like an English bitter or mild or something. You may not want to add any adjuncts to it because you don't want that extra alcohol character. You want a lot of dextrins, so maybe fermenting at high temperature, or the extreme like we were just talking about with non-alcohol. You mentioned that it's a fermentability. It can be a yeast issue that the yeast can't ferment maltose, or a fermentability issue where you can still have a brewer's yeast but mash at a very high temperature so that you're not getting a lot of that beta amylase activity. You're just getting those longer chain dextrins, and that's a way to make non-alcoholic beer. So you have all of these different ways that you can play with and increase or decrease your attenuation. Now, how about cold side issues? So again, cold side, we're thinking about starting after the whirlpool, after you've boiled the wort. So you've done your mash, you've boiled the wort, now you've got it over into the fermenter. What cold side things can we do to affect attenuation?
Yeah, so this comes down to really like how well you're treating your yeast, what other nutrients are provided to the yeast. So, some of it involves actually supplementing with nutrients on the hot side, but also just the oxygenation rate. If you're under oxygenating, then it doesn't allow for the yeast to go through its main growth phase to promote the cell biomass for a successful fermentation. So oxygenation is really critical to get your cell numbers in a good place for fermentation. And then, you can have an effect by how much you actually put in there. What's your pitch rate? Are you targeting, the appropriate pitch rate for the gravity of the wort that you produced? Because we usually use kind of a ballpark of, for most ales, like 0.75 to 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato. So Plato is a big factor there. If you're starting at 10 Plato, then you're at 10 million cells per mil. If you're at 20 Plato, then you're at 20 million cells per mil. So pitch rate plays in. And that's the pitch rate and oxygenation and nutrients. All of that's just allowing the yeast to get to its main, cell biomass or cell number to produce a successful fermentation. That getting those high Croizon counts, making sure you've got a vigorous fermentation started.
Yeah. And of course, also using a fresh yeast, right? Like using a quality yeast. I mean, even if you're propagating using a quality yeast, but if you're using fresh yeast, like from Omega Labs, that also plays a role, making sure that your yeast is healthy and still capable of fermenting. It's tough. I always think about this example. Harvesting yeast from a sour fermentation is difficult, right? If you're doing a kettle sour, that yeast has had to go through an environment that it's not, it can do its job, but it's unhappy during that time.
So, yeah, and I mean, it's same with like a dry hop. Dry hop's a stress on a yeast, and pitching from dry hop beers is usually not a successful fermentation, or not as successful, because you've limited, you have poor yeast health at that point. You're not getting the most out of that yeast anymore. Or even excessive storage times, or letting the beer, yeast sit under the beer for extended periods of time. All those add stress on the yeast. If you had a bad fermentation to start, you really don't want to reuse the yeast in the next fermentation. You want it coming from a healthy fermentation. So yeah, treat your yeast well.
Yeah, treat your yeast well. And then also understand your yeast's, what's going to happen to your yeast when you're doing other things, right? For example, we talked about on the hot side, adding dextrose is going to, allow your yeast to consume those sugars. But there's a flip side of that, right? Is it's going to take that sugar and it's going to turn it into alcohol. So you've got to understand too that the alcohol is a poison for the yeast, right? It's essentially poisoning in itself whenever it's fermenting. And at some point, the alcohol is going to become too much, right? It's going to become more than the yeast can handle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So take a brewing strain and put it into a wine fermentation, and you might not have as much attenuation in wine fermentation because they have higher ethanol tolerance, or they can tolerate the high alcohol percentages that are made in wine. So, alcohol tolerance is another impact on attenuation for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know actually off the top of my hand, maybe or top of my head, but maybe you know too. It's like I don't remember the typical tolerances for brewer's yeast, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 10 to 12 or 10 to 13 or something like that % alcohol before it really starts to shut down.
I mean, we've measured this across various kinds of strains, and Kveiks are very tolerant to higher ethanol concentrations. So, we've had some of our Kveiks reach up to 15% ABV.
Okay.
Lagers are pretty good with higher ethanol concentrations. And I think, sometimes we just have yeast that we've domesticated so far along that, we've spoiled them and they haven't seen high alcohol conditions. And so they're just really not ready to get much beyond 10%.
Yeah. So again, this is one of those, if you're brewing big beers, like you're brewing those, double IPAs or, imperial stouts or things like, or imperial porters. If you're pitching like OYL 004 and you're expecting 73 to 80% attenuation, but you pitched it into, a 20 degree Plato wort, at some point it's going to have produced so much alcohol that it's not going to be able to ferment anymore, and you're going to have a very low attenuation, maybe in like the 30 to 40% range, just because the yeast can't keep up.
That is definitely, and yeah, we see that quite a bit. Is like we've maxed out, we're at 12%, but still our and barrel aged stouts are kind of made this way nowadays. Like sometimes even starting all the way up at 40 Plato and only attenuating, 15 Plato. But this is where, brewers kind of design these expectations and attenuation and actually target something completely different, but they're really thoughtful in the way they think through that.
Yeah, they're realizing that, there's an upward limit here. There's an alcohol tolerance issue that we're going to come to, even if we provided it with all glucose, at 20 Plato. Again, like you said, you're going to hit that alcohol tolerance, which is an issue with seltzer yeast, right? Or with making seltzers, right? Is that you'll hit that alcohol tolerance. There's other things, of course, that we do, and you mentioned one of them earlier that we do to yeast. Adding hops causes some pressure on yeast, but it can also liberate some sugars through that hop creep phenomenon.
Definitely. So it's interesting, hop creep is essentially similar to putting enzymes into the cold side, except for there's only a small package of enzymes in the hops. So you've only really, you still have a limit to attenuation. You're not giving when we talked about the mash, we were talking about beta amylases. It's a good analogy for hop creep because beta amylases are one of the more active enzymes. But at some point, you will become substrate limited. The beta amylase will not work away on that dextrin anymore. So there's still a limit to attenuation even with hop creep. But hop creep will definitely lower your Plato and give you higher attenuation rates than you would anticipate without, adding the dry hop.
Yeah. Thinking about those sorts of things are always important too. And then this is a totally oddball question, but it was one that I was thinking about. Like, are attenuation and flocculation related? So do those things, are they interrelated? And I'll give you a little bit of my thought process. What I was thinking about is like, okay, if yeast are flocculating quickly, or have higher flocculation tendencies, are they falling out of solution before they've finished attenuation?
Yeah, so I don't think that there's not an obligate association there because they don't actually, like, the genes aren't linked and they aren't coming, the genetics differ between those two traits. But I would say most frequently, probably the selective pressure is similar for both flocculation and attenuation, or lower attenuation. So, I think with English strains, we've kind of evolved the lower attenuation rates and high flocculation rates. And with Belgian strains, we've evolved the low flocculation rates, but high attenuation rates. And that's just due to our selective pressure on the yeast. But it's coincidence. It's not. It's kind of just our way of domesticating those different types of yeast.
Amazing. Yeah, it's our selective pressure, but again, those genes are unrelated. And that's something that's so cool and so fascinating to me too about when we get into yeast genetics, talking about, all of the things that are happening in the future and now, right? I mean, with especially I think about the diacetyl knockout strains that you guys have released, right? You've now got OYL 004, which doesn't produce diacetyl, or it can still produce diacetyl, but it's better at cleaning it up, right? It cleans it up quicker.
Yeah, totally. And actually, just to think about a little bit deeper about attenuation rates, we learned some things when we do these engineering experiments. And, this was actually described probably in 2019, I think, by Chris Krogers. But the first kind of example of disrupting the STA gene in a Saison strain showed that the Saison strains actually rely on this enzyme that the glucoamylase, that diastatic ability to use maltotriose. Otherwise, they don't. If you get rid of that enzyme, they don't have a transporter or a permease that allows that uptake of maltotriose. So diastatic yeast evolved maltotriose utilization in an entirely different way by secreting an enzyme that breaks it down before the cells even have to take it up, which is pretty cool. So yeah, there's we learn lessons like that because we've taken the diastatic STA gene out of several of our strains, and they're really terrible fermenters. So it kind of surprised us. So like the most robust strains that we've previously thought were like the greatest attenuators. You just get rid of that STA gene and then they act like a wine strain.
Oh, fascinating, because it's a totally different mechanism. It's not that transporter that's in there. It's just secreting the enzyme outside the cell. Oh, fascinating. And so removing that enzyme outside the cell doesn't change anything about the transporter genetics. So
exactly. Yeah, and there's other so all over the yeast genome, there's really cool examples of how they've evolved these the capabilities of fermenting different sugars, and even the hexose transporters can be duplicated and more present in certain lineages, or even this enzyme called SUC2 invertase encoded by the SUC2 gene actually is released outside of the yeast and wine strains, and how they are able to use sucrose. It's an invertase enzyme that breaks down sucrose to glucose and fructose. So there's a lot of these examples of how yeast have become really creative fermenters and have used their genomes and kind of reorganized and made efforts to ferment what we give them.
That's amazing. It's just an adaptive organism. What I had a couple other questions real quick too. One is on managing and controlling attenuation. All of these things that we've talked about here on cold side, hot side. There's a great little graphic that they've put together on the Top Crop article. So I'd highly recommend that. And of course, the link to the article will be in the show notes, so you can click that link. But there's a really cool quick reference troubleshooting guide at the top of the article about attenuation, and essentially saying like, you want to improve attenuation, check these things. You want to decrease attenuation, check these things. Or you're not hitting your attenuation targets, check this. You're over attenuating, check this. And it's really cool. And sort of distills that down into a very quick checklist where you can say, okay, I've done this. Oh, here's where my problem is. But I wanted to ask a question. So we're talking about controlling attenuation, and I get this question all the time, especially from home brewers, but even commercial brewers occasionally. Should I be worried if my finishing gravity is off by half a degree Plato, or maybe 0.002 SG points? How much are we talking about we should worry when our attenuation is off?
I would definitely pay attention to those small changes in attenuation. If you're making one-off beers and you're expecting the same gravity range of a different malt profile to kind of finish in that same attenuation range, that's probably less realistic. But if you're brewing the same beer batch after batch, you really want to be in within a 0.1 to 0.2 Plato range in that finishing gravity, and even your target gravity. Obviously, that's important too. Are you always hitting 15 Plato out of the brew house? So those kinds of things, you should be able to target attenuation batch to batch with consistency. But when you're not consistent and you're doing more, one-off styles, it can be hard, and a half Play-Doh would be expected with different recipes.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And so it is kind of like depending on how you're brewing and what you're looking for. If you're, like you said, if you're brewing batch after batch and you need that consistency, then yeah, you should be worried if there's a half-degree Play-Doh difference. But if you're brewing a one-off batch and changing your recipe and all that stuff, and it's a half-degree Play-Doh difference, maybe it won't make that big of a deal. So all of this about attenuation, and of course I want to end the show by asking that same question I always do. If you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
Well, I think the big thing is, you have a lot of control over attenuation. It's not just how the yeast performs, but it's how you set up your dinner plate. That's like the great analogy, the great kind of just think about that as you're brewing. And on the hot side, making sure you've documented all your mash pHs, your rest times, you got your iodine check, you mash out. That's an important step, but making sure that your conversion on the hot side is pretty tight. You can get the predictability out of your yeast because you have good yeast health. And then you should be able to hit your target ranges and get into it's important for you to just do base beers, but also important to you when you're exploring some other styles like those non-alcoholic beers or dry hop beers and noticing differences in ABV and on a brand that you really need to hone in on. I just think that dinner plate example is a great way to think about it as a brewer. And then, the rest of the job that the yeast is set up to do, it should be able to do.
Yeah, think about setting up that dinner plate for the yeast so that it can succeed at fermentation. All right, was there anything else that you wanted to share about attenuation that we didn't get to today?
No, I think that's pretty good. We covered a lot of it, so I'm happy to be here and do that. I would definitely like to thank the rest of the team at Omega Yeast and Top Crop who put all the effort into this article on attenuation and helped to actually put design to the dinner plate idea that we all had. Let me just recognize Shayna for writing the article, Danielle for editing the article, and Dexter and Kyle for providing all the graphics for the article, because they've all definitely made these articles into what they are and not just a podcast, right?
Of course. And Laura, thank you so much for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Thank you.
All right. Well, of course, the link to the Top Crop article about attenuation that inspired this podcast will be in the show notes. And also, if you're not subscribed to Top Crop yet, you really should be. It's really fantastic content published by the folks there at Omega Yeast. There's new articles pretty much monthly at this point. Topics like attenuation, topics like diastaticus, topics like thiols, all of these cutting edge brewing topics that we've talked about on the show. So like I said, if you're not yet subscribed to Top Crop, please go check that out. Next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.